the following week after that, I was able to do all the full sets with increase in weight and all the full reps, and I had zero pain. Back in the day when I used to compete, I was prepping for a competition. It was actually nationals to break my record, basically. And I had a bad situation. I went out for sushi with, at the time, which was my girlfriend, and I'm eating sushi, having a great time, you know. So I'm not going to name any sushi places specifically. And I decided to eat a bunch of sushis. You know, it was a good night. I actually went home that night, just like stomach, like super bloated. Like, it was terrible. And then I literally, like, halfway through the night, had to like run to the bathroom because I was just like super sick. And I ended up catching food poisoning. And dude, it took me out for like 7 days. It was awful. It was like terrible. And I ended up losing like 3 kilos, right? And this was 8 weeks out from nationals, and I was aiming to break a national record. I was aiming to break the deadlift record at the time, and so this like crushed me. Like, I had no energy. Coming back to the gym was awful. It was just like a terrible experience. And I believe that competition ended up getting cancelled anyway due to COVID. But then later on, they did like a collate nationals, and I was able to prep for that. But like, that's pretty scary, right? It's just like all of a sudden you lose all this training momentum and you got to slowly build back up, especially out from a competition. It's like, what are you going to do? Like what is the best way to recover from sickness and, in extension, injury? You know, I think this is an important discussion that we should be having, like, because perhaps maybe you've been in a situation like this before, maybe you are in this situation, or maybe you even know somebody that's in this this predicament, and you want to try and help them out. It's just like, what are some pieces of advice you can give them? Okay, so let's actually break down what your situation is. Okay, you know, like, you're going to lose strength. You are weaker. You're going to be losing muscle mass. If it's an injured area, you're going to lose muscle mass in that area. If you're sick because you're not training, you're potentially going to be losing some muscle mass. Same concept with your strength, you know. If you're sick, you're probably going to lose strength in almost every aspect. If you're like injured, you're probably going to lose a lot of strength in a small area or in that area. So for example, like maybe like you tear a part of your quad. Your quad's going to be out for a while, man. I'm sorry, that's just how it is. And you're going to be pretty atrophied as well. You know, your body weight's potentially going to decrease because you'll just be sitting around with no appetite. You know, and there's another one, like your appetite's going to be down, and you're going to feel like shit. You know, physiologically, you're going to be quite stressed. And so cortisol is going to be super high. And so that's just like, boom, catabolism everywhere. Now you're breaking down heaps of muscle. And so it's not a good situation to be in, but it's the situation you are in. And so, like, you're going to have to accept this. You know, here's a bit of psychology. It's like, this is the predicament that you're in. This is the cards you're dealt with. If you're an athlete, as athletes, that's just like what we got to do. We've got to overcome these challenges in order to actually be successful. No athlete ever has had a linear progression of like beginner to advanced. That just doesn't exist. There's always hurdles to overcome. And there's always something to learn as well. Like, back to my story, it's just like, I learnt I shouldn't be eating sushi 8 weeks out from a national competition, especially if I was supposed to be cutting for the competition, and then I just lose a bunch of muscle because I get food poisoning. And so, like, you've got to understand, like, there's nothing you can do, like, right now. There is stuff you can do, and we're going to talk about that, but you can't just, like, teleport back into the past and not eat that piece of sushi. You've just got to deal with the situation. And so, like, psychologically, get prepared to be a bit more stoic. Just be accepting. Try to be as grounded as you can. Because the more chillax you are about the situation, the better you are going to be. Because you'll produce less cortisol. And that's going to... And less cortisol, to a point, obviously, like, the less added stress that's not training stress is going to be a benefit to you. And so keep all that in mind. That is what you're going to have to do. And understand as well, like, you are going to return back to normal. If you're injured, you are going to potentially recover 100%, and especially your performance. And you might even exceed your performance if you're sick. Absolutely. Obviously, if you've got a disease which might knock you out, I'm sorry, or if you've torn, or maybe your injury is an amputee, I'm sorry, but you can't do calf raises, so you're not going to be able to perform to your calf raise performance before. It's just like you don't have a calf anymore. And if you're going to get sick in a bad way, look, man, I mean, like, you can try and be as jacked as you can, but people aren't going to remember you for being jacked anyway. In those situations, it is what it is, all right? But for the most part, you will make a full recovery, and you will exceed previous performance. This podcast isn't like how to overcome being sick. This is how to overcome injury and sickness for athletic performance. Specifically, in my case, powerlifting, and in your case, whatever sport you do. And so, psychologically accept the situation, become more stoic, and understand that you will return back to a level of normal. It's okay. Okay, so let's say you've now overcome the sickness to a point where you can train. Let's touch on that really quickly. How sick is okay when training? Ideally 0. Thank you for your attention in this podcast. If you want to learn a bit more about FitBigStrong, we have an Instagram page where you can go check out. So if you head over to Instagram and type in FitBigStrong, it will take you to our page, and we post a lot of unique and fresh Instagram content in the form of reels. So 10 to 30 second short clips, which are straight to the point. If you want to head over there and support us by giving us a follow, hopefully we return the value with the type of content we produce. If that's something you're interested in, again, head over to Instagram, type in @FitBigStrong, and thank you in advance. The reason being, your immune system is what actually repairs the muscle and repairs the tissues in the body. So, like, super, super overly simplified, but just for logical reasons, like a logical understanding, you break down the muscle, your immune system comes in with the right signals, repairs your muscle and makes it slightly bigger than what it was, and then boom, problem solved. And so if you are sick, and your immune system's fighting off a sickness, how much muscle growth are you going to get? Or how much are you going to inhibit your body's ability to recover from the sickness if it's also trying to recover some muscle? It's not going to just we'll deal with this muscle in 2 weeks. It's going to kind of spread its resources a little bit thinner, which is not good. That's not good. And so my answer is until you're fully recovered. It's just how it is. You'll feel better. Everything will be sweet. And so, injury-wise, how do we know to return? It's a bit different for injuries, and we're going to cover that in a little bit. So sickness. The goal is to return to the old performance when entering back into training. So if you originally were squatting 80 kilos for 10 reps, then we want to move towards 80 kilos for 10 reps again. And so, but what should we start out with if that was our previous performance? Well, you might want to consider if, let's say, the week of training, you did 4 sets of 10 at 80 kilo squats, and then you did 3 sets of 12 20 kilo Bulgarian split squats. That was the last workout before you got sick. Just a good coming back introductory, half the volume and then half the intensity. And because that means instead of doing 2x12 at 20 kilos, you might be doing 2x6 at 10 kilos. And so, yeah, that's more than technically half of volume, but in the case of volume, I'm talking about half the sets, and then half the reps, and then half the intensity, which is half the weight. And so you're starting off super hard, not super hard, super easy. And there's a rationale for that. There's a big rationale for that. And your training should be no higher, absolutely no higher than RPE6. It's this training is potentially even easier than your deloads. That's by design. Because after you come back from sickness, you're actually probably really sensitive to muscle growth as it is and sensitive to volume because you've basically done like an accidental active rest phase. And so like you're primed to grow. Yeah, you're in a worse situation than you were, potentially a really worse situation, but you're really sensitive. And so you have to play it very carefully. That's just the game that we play. And that's the situation you're in. And so you might find that half the volume and half the intensity of what you used to do is actually kind of challenging. You know, you have to struggle a little bit. You're getting out of breath on those squats, which is like fine. But even if you like do like one or two reps of your last warm up and you're like, man, that's going to be higher than RPE 6, then don't do it. Like just don't go that hard. Drop it even more. No higher than RPE 6 because you'll just ramp up the intensity really, really hard, especially when your joints and tendons are not acclimated to training anymore. And so you potentially risk injury quite high. And we don't want to injure you, right? So keep that in mind when you are progressing your training. So that's week 1. Week 2, how are we moving in? Week 3, week 4. Look, you don't want to go like incredibly slow. I'm not telling you to add like 1 rep or, you know, like 2.5 kilos potentially every like month, right? Like we don't want slow, but we want consistent progress, okay? And so like, why do I say that? Well, like if you go week 1, you go, this is super easy. And then you feel amazing week 2 and you just like ramp up the volume. In this case, by double and the intensity potentially by double, your tendons and joints aren't recovered yet, but they're going to recover really quickly. And so you got to like, you kind of judge your progression model based on last week, like last week's performance. And so like, if you go, you know, you hit week 1, you know, you do half your volume. Next week, maybe you add 5 kilos to your lifts and you add a set and maybe you add a couple reps, right? And you go, fuck, that moved really easy. Again, that was like RPE 6 or less. Next week, repeat the exact same progression model. And then eventually you work up from like 2x12, let's say, to 4x12. Or no, 2x6. And now you're back up to 4x12 with relatively similar weight. Or maybe less weight. The point is, it has to be a consistent level of progress. That is the game. And what exercises should you be doing? Well, you probably shouldn't be like super specific. Be okay to be a bit more general and spread out your exercises. Train the joints and tendons to different ranges of motion. So if you're a powerlifter and then you get sick on your peak, don't just start peaking again. That's a really bad idea. Or like if you're a bodybuilder, maybe it's a bad idea to start doing heaps of metabolite stuff. Just do some like general training. So maybe like even like different exercises. So instead of just like squatting 3 times a week comp specific, maybe do like safety bar squat or pause squats. Like just kind of build like a base because you've lost your base, right? And that's what we need to do is we need to rebuild the base so that our peak is way higher. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, the bigger the base, the higher the peak. So if you are a better general athlete, you will become a better specific athlete. But if you're a better specific athlete, you won't necessarily become a better general athlete. And so what we need to be doing is we need to be building a big foundation of muscle mass, of skill, of strength, of like true strength. And then we express that in our training, in our performance. That's basically like athletic performance summarized, right? And we do that through periodization. That's a completely different topic. But consider training more general so we can build up that base. So if you're injured, it is the same performance goal, except we use a different approach. What we want to do is we want to turn flexibility into mobility. What does that mean? So when we injure ourselves, we can't, let's say, go through that range of motion anymore without pain, right? So we need to develop that range of motion without pain, okay? And so, you know, once we develop that range of motion, then we want to strengthen that range of motion. And so let's say you tear your hamstring, right? And you can barely touch your toes. And now you've been able to train yourself over time to now you can touch your toes. Great. You have more flexibility and the muscle can go through that range of motion. Now we want to slowly load that and strengthen the tissue so that it's strong in that range of motion. For example, let's say you're finishing your last block. You did like 4x8 RDLs at like 140 kilos. You've got big hamstrings. And let's say you tore it because, I don't know, it just tore. That's probably bullshit. But let's say you just tore it. If you had hamstrings like that, it's hard to tear them. Unless you tear them, which then it's not hard to tear them. That made no sense. Okay, back to what I was saying. And then you tear it, you might not be able to touch your toes. But then you're able to touch your toes. And now you're doing like an RDL with a bar. And now you slowly build up to the strength of the 140 again. Like, your hamstrings are almost like, they're probably completely healed. Like, and you've got like no scar tissue. It's great. So that's what I mean by turning flexibility into mobility. Because, quick definition, flexibility is just the range of motion your muscle can go through. Mobility is that same range of motion, but how strong are you? So, for example, if you're doing like bench press, and you can touch your bar. Like, let's say your 1 rep max is like 100 kilos, right? But you can do 120 kilos if you half rep it. And so there's an example of, mobility of like, if you can then do 120 kilos with that full range of motion, it's like, it's the amount of strength you have in a range of motion. It's more of a conceptual thing than like a mathematical thing. Are you more mobile if you can bench 120 half repped? No. You're more mobile if you can now bench 120 with full reps. Hopefully that makes sense. But that's kind of like what we want to do. When it comes to exercise considerations for injury, it's very important that we challenge the muscles and the connective tissue and everything like that around the injury and of the injury in lots of ranges of motions, in different joint angles and stress curves and all this kind of stuff. We want to be very general and we want to be very broad with our exercise selection, just so that we are supplying blood flow to all the tissues in all the different ways so that healing can take place. It's like if I only did, imagine this, right? Where you did bicep curls. And if you only did supinated bicep curls, only one head of the bicep got activated. The second one never got activated. But if we did a combination of both, we can train both heads, right? Same concept with the injury. It's just like blood flow is critical to the repair process. And so we need to be supplying blood flow throughout the entire area that's injured, because we don't want to leave anything lagging. We want it to all heal. So yeah, that's the considerations. In regards to progressing your training if you were injured, there are some important considerations. So initially, after you develop flexibility, developing flexibility, I can't give you an exact scientific approach because it's not my expertise. I have knowledge in strength and conditioning, and so I can perform that. Physios are a great option. If you've taught something like a major thing or even like a minor thing, a physio is basically your best friend. And so they'll help you develop flexibility and, deep tissue massages and everything you need. But once you develop that flexibility, you need to be finding movements which have very little to no pain when performed, that you can progress. And so, like, for example, what's a good example? Let's say you tore your quad, right? Here we go. You have patellar tendonitis. I'm going to run with this one. And doing a squat causes a lot of pain. But doing reverse Nordic curls does not cause any pain, or it causes very mild pain. Which one are you going to use to supply blood flow to the local area? You're probably going to use the reverse Nordics. Or, let's say you could potentially train that knees over toes position using reverse sled pulls. And that causes very little pain, but you still get blood flow through the area, and you can still get stronger on that exercise. So that is what you need to be considering. It's like, what exercises am I going to use so that I can strengthen this area with very little pain, and progress these movements slow and steady. When you're sick, you can sort of titrate up quicker, but consistently. You want to do the same thing with if you're injured, except your progression model is much slower. You want to be progressing slower and consistent with no pain or very little pain. We're going to talk about that specifically in a second. but you want your progression to be nice and slow. That means adding a rep, adding 2.5 kilos every 2 weeks, like adding a set potentially and keeping the weight and the reps the same. You want to slowly increase the stress to the tissues so that you can stimulate healthy repair, but you don't want to go so quick that you cause an excessive amount of damage and you just backtrack. That's the balance. And the balance, I generally believe it's a good idea to use pain as a metric of progress. And so if you're injured and you are trying to strengthen an area, any pain higher than 3 out of 10 ever should just be avoided. In most cases, for you. I don't know who you are, but 3 out of 10 is like the maximum cutoff. I didn't find this from any literature. It's from my experience that the general population, if they feel like it's a 3 out of 10, it's probably not that much pain. If I said it was a 3 out of 10, it's probably somebody else's like 5 out of 10. So, basically ooh, you notice it. Like, for example, I tore my teres major a couple weeks ago now, actually. And, I did it deadlifting for some reason. Actually, that reason is I had tight internal rotators. But one of the exercises, that I was doing the other day in the gym, a lat pull down, is reverse grip. And so after 1 set, I feel fine. After 2 sets, I felt it flare up. And it was like a 3 out of 10 pain. And so I just immediately stopped. That's an example. And now the next week, the following week after that, I was able to do all the full sets with increase in weight and all the full reps, and I had 0 pain. But what happens if I kept pushing that day? I might have injured it even more or gone back to a state of high injury instead of low injury starting to repair. So that's something to keep in mind, is pain is your friend. And back to progression really quickly, you don't have to use the same exercise over and over. So for example, you might find reverse Nordic curls is really good for your patellar tendon, but you can't just load it anymore because you're getting too strong. You're starting to heal too much. What you could do instead is you now move on to goblet squats with heel elevated goblet squats. Great. That is a form of progression. You're using a more harder exercise to facilitate that repair and blood flow. So just then, we defined what you should be doing when you reintroduce yourself to training, and then what you should be doing following training to ensure that you get reliable, consistent, healthy repair of the tissues. So let's quickly break down what you should not be doing. You should not fucking max out if you're sick or injured until you're back to normal. Do not max out. Do not max out. Do not max out. If you're watching the video, I'm rubbing my temple, staring at the camera with concern. Do not max out, okay? Your tissues and connective tissue and your contractile tissue are not prepared to handle these loads, and you will potentially risk a large amount of injury, right? And if you are actually injured, your tissues are definitely not prepared, and you're at such an exponential increase of injury risk. It is mind-blowing. You do not need to see where you are at to figure out where you are at. You don't need to know where you are at because it just doesn't matter. You need to be responsible. If you want to see where you're at, find out what half your usual intensity and volume feels like. If it feels like shit, that's where you're at. You're at rock bottom. You suck right now. You were told to accept that, so please accept that. The reason why I'm drilling this at home so much is I'm worried that somebody, okay, so we have COVID, right? That's the thing. When it was a real big thing and gyms were shutting down, once they reopened, people with after 6 weeks of not training would come to the gym and max out. Gotta see where I'm at, brother. No, you don't. You just need to wait patiently and slowly build up. Everybody who slowly built up is now stronger and bigger than you. Why is that? Because they have developed a discipline and they are mature. They're not going to throw themselves into the fire pit without wearing a hazmat suit. Not a hazmat suit, a fire protection suit. It's like maxing out when you are not ready to max out is like sending an amateur firefighter to rescue a group of orphans in a burning building with no ladder, no hose, no oxygen mask. Just like, go in there, man. Like, try and get someone, you know? It's like, now everyone's dead. Okay, look, that's my rant over. That's it. Let's not max out. And in relatively similar, this is just like more like a common mistake, because when you feel so good and you base your training decisions around emotion, it's very tempted to just ramp up the intensity like crazy. So that's why I emphasize the importance of a consistent progression model instead of just like, feel good, push. Because ramping up the intensity, like, look, your muscles can get so strong that your tendons and joints and connective tissue can't repair at the same rate. And the reason for that is often blood flow. Like, for example, connective tissue in your joints often receives zero blood flow, and the only nourishment it gets is actually from the synovial fluid. And so it's like some of these tissues just don't have as much raw resources as muscle, and isn't as metabolically active, and therefore can't receive adequate repair. So your muscles might get 20% stronger, and then your tendons might get 5% stronger, but the 20% actually stretches the tendon past its maximum level of tolerableness. And so, so picture this really quick. So when you pull on a tendon, it's elastic, and so it stretches, and it builds up elastic tension. Eventually, there's a range of how much you can stretch it or apply force in which it will return back to. That is its elastic range. If you pull it any past that, you can stretch it beyond that, and it won't come back to its original space. You might develop micro tears. You might literally tear the entire thing. And so you can get so strong so quickly that you pull the tendons past its maximum elastic range, I'm going to call it, and you just get, it's like pop, you just tore your tendon off the bone or off the muscle. And so that's why it's important to be very consistent and slow, not specifically slow, but steady and consistent progress. It's very important, very, very important. And thirdly, pushing past a high pain tolerance. If you are feeling lots of pain, do not push it. It can just wait till next session. For me, in my injury, which is 100% now, I just waited till next session and I doubled the performance, right? Keep in mind, I applied all the same principles, right? I slowly titrated up. I basically took a week off training. I titrated up week 1. For that exercise, for some weird reason, it felt weird, so I stopped. And then the week 2, I felt amazing. Given the point, I was working with a physio to make these decisions as well, and you probably should as well, but do not push past high pain. Anything above 3 out of 10, just stop. It's not worth it. It's not important. Would you rather, if you knew that if you decided to push one session too hard, you wouldn't be able to train for another 30 sessions to a high standard, if you just knew that, you could see into the future, you wouldn't do it. And every time you do, you gamble. Except you're not gambling with good odds. You're gambling with pretty low odds. And you know the odds are low. You can see the odds are low because you're feeling a lot of pain. It might be made up pain, but there's pain there. And unless you're with a professional who's telling you, you're good, bro, you're not good, okay? That is the rules.